The air inside the terminal was heavy with the familiar mix of coffee, perfume, and the faint scent of jet fuel that drifted in every time the automatic doors opened. Travelers hurried in every direction, clutching bags, dragging suitcases, or staring at glowing screens as flight numbers flickered across digital boards. In this river of strangers, each person carried their own story, their own reasons for traveling, and their own private battles. Among them was Maya Johnson, a young woman in her late 20s with strong shoulders and a determined face. She was dressed simply in comfortable clothes, her hair tied neatly back, her eyes focused. To the casual observer, she looked like any other traveler. But for Maya, this trip meant more than just another flight. She had been invited to speak at a conference on diversity in the workplace, something she had worked years to achieve. It was her first time being asked to share her voice in front of an international audience. To her, the chance felt like proof that all her hard work was beginning to matter. Maya carried herself with calm dignity. She did not need to shout for attention or take up space with noise. She walked with quiet purpose, her ticket in hand, her backpack slung across her shoulder. For years, she had learned the balance between being visible enough to claim her space and invisible enough to avoid unnecessary conflict. But this day would test her in ways she never imagined. A few gates down, Jason Miller leaned against a column with his arms crossed, his bright floral shirt unbuttoned at the top, revealing a heavy gold chain that caught the overhead lights. Jason was tall, broad-shouldered, and loud. He had been drinking since the early afternoon, using the airport bar as his personal waiting room. His laughter boomed across the seating area as he scrolled through his phone, muttering about delays and rolling his eyes at announcements. People gave him space not because of respect but because of unease. His presence filled the room in an unpleasant way, like static that made the air uncomfortable. Jason was heading to a beach resort, a trip he had bragged about to anyone within earshot. But beneath his holiday excitement was a streak of bitterness, the kind that hardened a person over time. He had always been quick to judge, quick to raise his voice, and quicker still to target those who looked different from him. At the bar, he had already made snide comments about a family speaking another language and mocked the tired appearance of an elderly man. Most ignored him, but his words left marks on the atmosphere, invisible scratches of disrespect that others carried silently. When boarding was called, passengers lined up with the usual mix of exhaustion and relief. Maya found her place in the line, double-checked her seat number, and offered a small smile to the elderly woman behind her. Jason, meanwhile, cut his way forward, brushing past others with a careless shove, muttering about how people needed to move faster. By the time they both reached their seats, fate had placed them only a few rows apart. The cabin hummed with the sounds of luggage being shoved into overhead bins and the soft chatter of families settling in. Maya sat by the window, placing her backpack carefully beneath the seat in front of her. She looked out at the tarmac, where ground crew moved with precise efficiency, guiding luggage carts and fueling trucks. For a moment, the sight gave her peace. She thought about the speech she had prepared, the message she wanted to share, and how her parents would be proud if they could see her now. Jason dropped heavily into his aisle seat 2 rows away. He stretched his legs wide, took off his sunglasses, and immediately pressed the call button for the flight attendant. "Yeah, I'll take a whiskey," he said loudly before they had even begun safety checks. The flight attendant gave a polite but firm smile, reminding him that drinks would be served after takeoff. Jason waved her off with a scoff, as though rules did not apply to him. As the plane lifted into the sky, most passengers leaned back, adjusting to the vibration and hum of ascent. Maya opened her notebook, going over her notes one last time. She was not nervous exactly, but she wanted every word to be right. She believed in what she had to say, and she hoped it would inspire those who listened. Across the aisle, Jason grew restless. He shifted in his seat, sighed dramatically, and muttered complaints about how cramped the plane was. A mother with 2 children tried to calm them as they grew restless, and Jason rolled his eyes so loudly that it was almost a performance. "Control your kids," he barked, drawing stares from nearby passengers. The mother flushed with embarrassment, whispering apologies to her little ones. Maya noticed, and her heart sank. She had seen this before. People like Jason who wielded their voices like weapons, cutting through peace and leaving others diminished. She closed her notebook and looked out the window again, reminding herself that kindness could often be the quietest form of resistance. But deep inside, she also knew that silence could be mistaken for permission. The flight smoothed into its rhythm, attendants moving gracefully down the aisles, offering drinks and snacks. Conversations rose and fell like gentle waves. But beneath it all, tension simmered. Jason's voice carried more than anyone else's. His laugh grating, his complaints endless. He was the kind of man who believed the world owed him comfort, and he had no patience for anything less. For Maya, the hours ahead would not just test her patience but her spirit. She had not sought conflict. She had not raised her voice or provoked anger. Yet sometimes life chooses moments for us, moments that ask who we truly are when the weight of another person's hate tries to press us down. At 30,000 feet above the ground, in a cabin of strangers sealed within metal walls, the stage was being set. The story of that flight would not be remembered for its destination, nor for its turbulence or food service. It would be remembered for what happens when cruelty believes it can go unchecked, and when dignity refuses to bow. For now, Maya sat quietly by the window, unaware of how close the storm was. Jason leaned back in his seat, finishing his drink, convinced he controlled the energy of the cabin. But soon their paths would collide in a way that would test them both, and the lives of everyone watching would be changed forever. The flight had settled into the calm that comes once the initial rush of boarding and takeoff is over. The engines hummed steadily beneath the wings, and most passengers were either flipping through magazines, adjusting their seats, or staring blankly at the tiny entertainment screens in front of them. To anyone watching, it was an ordinary flight. Yet inside the cabin there was a subtle heaviness in the air, the kind that is hard to describe but easy to feel. People were alert even if they did not say it aloud, and that weight came from one man. Jason sat 2 rows from Maya, his voice carrying in bursts that broke through the soft murmur of the cabin. He had ordered his first drink the moment the attendants gave permission, and by the time the cart had passed his row, his laughter was already sharper, his words more careless. For Jason, the flight was a stage, and he acted as though everyone around him was his unwilling audience. He complained loudly about the seats, called the food garbage, and even joked about how he had paid too much money to fly in a bus with wings. At first, some passengers forced polite smiles, the kind people wear when they hope irritation will disappear if ignored. But as his comments grew bolder, the smiles faded. Maya, sitting by the window, tried to focus on her notes, her neat handwriting covering the pages of her small journal. Her presentation was important to her, not just because of the professional opportunity, but because it gave her a chance to speak about respect, about equality, about what it meant to hold space for one another. She knew the power of words, the way they could either build bridges or break them down. She had seen it in her own life. That was why she prepared so carefully, why every sentence in her notebook had been thought over again and again. But it was hard to concentrate when Jason's voice kept cutting through the air like a saw. The first moment their paths crossed directly was small, almost forgettable. Maya had pressed the button above her to call a flight attendant. She needed water. Her throat felt dry after reading for so long, and she wanted a moment of refreshment before diving back into her work. Jason noticed the light come on and leaned into the aisle. "What, you can't wait?" he said loudly, not even looking at her. "Some of us have been waiting forever for a refill." His tone dripped with annoyance, as if her request was somehow a personal offense. Maya did not respond. She simply smiled politely at the attendant when they arrived, accepted her water, and whispered a soft thank you. But her silence to Jason was not enough. People like him thrived on reaction, and when they did not get it, they dug deeper. A few minutes later, as she returned to her notes, she could hear him muttering under his breath, just loud enough for nearby passengers to catch fragments of his words. "Always getting special treatment," he said. "Figures." The mother with the children 2 rows ahead turned to glare at him, but Jason just smirked as though daring her to challenge him. Maya shifted slightly in her seat. She was not a stranger to such comments. Life had taught her that sometimes the hardest battles were fought in silence. But she also knew that silence could sometimes be mistaken for weakness, and that thought began to weigh on her as the minutes passed. The breaking of the fragile peace came when the flight attendants began serving meals. The cart moved slowly down the aisle, the smell of reheated food filling the cabin. Maya tucked away her journal and waited patiently. When the attendant reached her, she smiled, accepted her tray, and set it carefully on her fold-out table. Jason, however, leaned into the aisle, waving his hand impatiently. "Took you long enough," he barked. I thought I was going to starve back here." His tone was sharp, his words heavy with entitlement. When the attendant reminded him kindly that they were moving as fast as possible, he scoffed and turned toward Maya. "Bet you got yours quick though, huh?" he said, his voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear. This time Maya lifted her eyes. She did not speak at first. She simply met his gaze, calm but steady. The kind of look that holds a mirror to a person. Jason shifted in his seat, uncomfortable for a second, before covering it with a laugh. "Relax," he said. "It's just a joke." But his laugh carried no warmth, only the sharpness of someone used to hiding cruelty behind humor. Other passengers noticed. Some looked away, choosing the safety of silence. Others glanced toward Maya as though waiting to see how she would respond. She breathed in deeply, then exhaled slowly. With measured calm, she said, "Respect is not a joke." Her voice was soft but firm, the kind that did not need to rise to be heard. The cabin went quiet for a moment. Jason's grin faltered, but only for a second. Then he leaned back in his seat, shaking his head. "Oh, here we go," he muttered. "Always playing the victim. Always making everything about respect and fairness. Can't take a joke, huh?" His words spilled into the air, thick with dismissal. But instead of diminishing her, they revealed him. People began to see him more clearly, not as the confident man he pretended to be, but as someone small, someone who needed to tear others down to feel tall. Maya turned back to her tray and began eating, choosing not to waste energy on someone who thrived on negativity. But Jason could not let it go. His voice grew louder, his words sharper, as if her quiet composure was the greatest insult he could imagine. "You think you're better than me?" he asked suddenly, his tone rising. The question was not really a question. It was a challenge, a demand for her to give him the fight he was craving. Still, she did not take the bait. She ate calmly, her every movement steady, controlled. The tension was no longer just between them. The whole cabin felt it now. Passengers sat straighter in their seats, their eyes darting between Maya and Jason. The attendants exchanged uneasy glances, whispering to one another about whether to intervene. But something about the way Maya held herself gave them pause. She was not shrinking. She was not afraid. And that quiet strength was more powerful than shouting could ever be. Jason, however, mistook her calm for arrogance. In his mind, he was losing control of the space, losing the invisible dominance he had always relied on, and for someone like him, that loss was unbearable. He leaned forward, his voice low this time, meant only for her ears. "You don't belong here," he said. "People like me built this world, and people like you are just taking advantage." The words were cruel, meant to wound, but Maya did not flinch. Instead, she met his eyes once more, and for the first time, Jason saw something he did not expect. Not fear, not anger, but strength. The kind of strength that comes from knowing who you are, from standing on ground no one can take away. The silence between them stretched long and heavy, and though Jason filled it with muttering, with shifting, with forced laughter, everyone on the plane had felt the shift. Something was building, something that could no longer be ignored. The tension was no longer just words floating in the air. It had become a storm on the horizon, visible to all, impossible to avoid. Maya returned to her meal, her thoughts focused not on Jason's words but on the truth she carried inside. She knew that battles were not always chosen. Sometimes they chose you, and she could feel that choice pressing closer with every passing minute. The cabin lights had dimmed slightly, giving the impression of calm, but inside, the energy was far from peaceful. People had begun to notice how Jason's voice cut through every pocket of conversation, his tone louder, more confrontational with each passing minute. Maya remained steady in her seat, her journal tucked away now, her gaze fixed on the clouds outside her window. She knew the difference between ignorance and hostility. Ignorance could sometimes be ignored, but hostility demanded a choice. Either one allowed it to grow unchecked or one stood firm. She hoped the journey would end without the need for the latter, but deep inside she felt the shift coming. Jason had grown restless after the meal service. He had finished 2 drinks and was already gesturing for another, though the attendant reminded him gently that service was on pause for turbulence. That answer only fueled his irritation. He muttered curses under his breath, tossing his napkin onto the floor and leaning back in his seat with exaggerated motions, as though the whole world had wronged him. His eyes kept drifting back toward Maya, narrowing every time she ignored him. For him, silence was not neutrality. It was defiance, and defiance was something he had never known how to handle. The moment came when Maya rose from her seat to stretch her legs. She had been sitting for hours, her muscles stiff, her thoughts restless. She excused herself quietly, stepping into the narrow aisle with the grace of someone who never wanted to disturb others. As she began walking toward the back, Jason stood abruptly, his large frame blocking the aisle. The suddenness of it startled the passengers nearby. A hush fell over the immediate rows as people turned to see what was happening. "Where do you think you're going?" Jason said, his words slurred slightly from the alcohol, but his tone sharp. His arm stretched across the aisle, barring her path as though he had the right to control her movement. Maya paused, her face calm but her posture straight. "I am just stretching my legs," she replied evenly, her voice neither loud nor confrontational. "Please step aside." Jason smirked, leaning in closer, his voice dropping lower so that only the closest passengers could hear. "Always acting like you're better than everyone else," he hissed. "You think you can just walk past me? Not today." Maya's heart pounded, but her face betrayed nothing. She had faced hostility before, though not in this confined space, not in front of so many silent witnesses. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or to retreat into the safety of pretending nothing was wrong. It was human nature to look away from conflict, but this time, the moment was too loud to ignore. "Sir," Maya said, still calm, still steady, "please remove your arm." Jason laughed. But it was not the laugh of amusement, it was the laugh of a man clinging to control. He dropped his arm suddenly, but then stepped closer, his body towering over her in the narrow aisle. The movement was aggressive, designed to intimidate, to remind her of the difference in size, in power, in entitlement. Without warning, he shoved his hand against her shoulder, not hard enough to knock her back, but hard enough to send a ripple of shock through the cabin. The collective gasp of the passengers was immediate. It was not just the act itself, but the audacity of it. In the confines of a plane where safety depends on civility, to put hands on another passenger was unthinkable. A flight attendant rushed forward, her eyes wide, her voice sharp. "Sir, step back right now," she demanded, but Jason barely acknowledged her. He was locked onto Maya, waiting for her to flinch, to cower, to confirm the story he had always told himself. That power belonged to him, but Maya did not flinch. She did not shrink back or drop her gaze. Instead, she stood taller, her shoulders squaring, her eyes locking on his with a steadiness that made him falter for just a second. The silence between them stretched long enough for everyone in the cabin to feel it. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than words, the kind that tells the truth without needing to shout. "I will not be disrespected," Maya said quietly, but firmly. Her words carried not because of volume, but because of weight. They sank into the air, into the hearts of the passengers who had been holding their breath. Jason opened his mouth to laugh again, but no sound came out. For the first time, he was not in control of the narrative. The attendants stepped closer, positioning themselves between Maya and Jason, their voices now firmer, warning him to return to his seat. But Jason, red-faced and restless, jabbed a finger toward Maya. "She thinks she can talk to me like that?" He spat. "On my flight?" The passengers around him stirred now, some shaking their heads, others murmuring in disapproval. A man across the aisle finally spoke up. "It's not your flight," he said sharply. "Sit down." His voice was enough to embolden others. Whispers turned into louder calls for him to calm down, to let it go. For years, Jason had relied on silence to protect him, but now silence had broken. The eyes of the entire cabin were on him, and the mirror Maya had held up revealed him for who he truly was. Maya did not gloat. She did not raise her voice or return his aggression. Instead, she stood steady, her dignity intact, her silence stronger than any insult. The attendants guided her gently back toward her seat, assuring her they would handle the situation. But everyone watching knew what they had witnessed. It was more than just a confrontation between two passengers. It was a moment where cruelty believed it could reign unchecked, and was met instead with unshakable strength. As Maya returned to her seat, passengers offered her small nods, soft words of support whispered in passing. Jason, meanwhile, was forced back into his chair, his protest drowned out by the hum of disapproval that surrounded him. For the first time in a long time, he was not the loudest voice in the room. He sat seething, but beneath the anger was something he did not know how to name: shame. The flight pressed on, but the energy in the cabin had changed. People no longer saw Jason as the dominant force he had tried to be. They saw Maya, calm and steady, as the true center of the story. And though no one said it aloud, each person knew they had witnessed a turning point. The breaking point had come and gone, and with it, the balance of power had shifted forever. The cabin had grown quieter after the confrontation, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that hummed with tension, like the air before a storm. People shifted in their seats, whispering softly to one another, casting glances toward Jason and Maya. The attendants had done what they could, issuing stern warnings to Jason and reminding him that further misconduct could result in authorities meeting the plane upon landing. Still, everyone knew warnings meant little to a man like him. His pride had been wounded in front of an entire cabin of witnesses, and men like Jason did not know how to swallow pride without lashing out. He sat rigid in his seat, fists clenching and unclenching, his jaw tight as though he were chewing on his own anger. Maya, meanwhile, had returned to her window seat. She adjusted her seatbelt, smoothed her clothes, and folded her hands in her lap. To the outside eye, she looked composed, but inside, her thoughts swirled. She had spent her life walking the fine line between defending herself and protecting her peace. She had always believed that her strength did not lie in how loudly she could respond to cruelty, but in how firmly she could stand in the truth of who she was. Yet she also knew that sometimes standing meant more than sitting quietly and enduring. Sometimes it meant drawing a line so clearly that no one could mistake where she stood. And as she sat there, listening to Jason mutter under his breath, she realized this was one of those moments. Passengers nearby heard him too. His words were low but laced with venom. He grumbled about how people like her always get away with things, and how the world had gone soft. A couple in the row behind him exchanged glances, their discomfort obvious, but like many others, they hesitated to step in. That hesitation was not cowardice, it was fear. Fear of escalation, fear of conflict, fear of becoming the next target. Maya understood that fear, but she also knew that silence in moments like these was not neutral. It was fuel. Fuel for men like Jason, who thrived on intimidation. When the turbulence settled and the attendants began moving again, Maya unbuckled her belt. She stood slowly, her figure steady, her presence suddenly larger than before. The cabin seemed to shift as eyes followed her, curious, uncertain, waiting to see what she would do. Jason looked up, his smirk returning, convinced that she had risen to argue, to shout, to match his hostility. But Maya's approach was different. She did not lean into anger, she leaned into truth. "Sir," she said, her voice calm yet commanding enough to cut through the low hum of the engines. "I will not allow you to continue disrespecting me or anyone else on this flight." Her tone was measured, not raised, but every syllable carried weight. The kind of weight that only comes when words are spoken from a place of unshakable conviction. Jason barked a laugh, his chest puffing as he leaned back in his seat. "Oh, here she goes again," he said loudly, looking around as though expecting the other passengers to laugh with him, but no one did. The silence that followed was not one of agreement but of solidarity with Maya. Eyes turned toward her, not him. Heads nodded slightly, quietly affirming her courage. Jason's laugh faltered. Maya continued, her gaze locked on him. "You may think your words and actions make you powerful," she said, "but real power is not in how loudly you can insult others. Real power is in how you treat people, in the respect you show, even when no one can force you to give it. That is what strength looks like." Her words hung in the air, echoing louder than any shout could. Jason shifted in his seat, his smirk flickering as the weight of her calm settled over him. He tried to scoff, to wave her off, but the passengers around them were no longer silent. A voice from the back called, "She's right." Another added, "We're tired of your nonsense." Soon, murmurs of agreement spread across the cabin, a tide rising against him. For the first time, Jason found himself outnumbered not by fists or by force, but by truth. Maya had drawn the line and the others had stepped across it with her. The attendants moved closer again, but this time they did not just speak to Jason. They spoke with the authority of knowing the cabin was behind them. "Sir, this is your final warning," one of them said firmly. "If you continue this behavior, you will not only be removed from the aircraft upon landing but banned from future flights." Jason bristled, his fists tightening once more, but when he looked around, he saw no support. The faces staring back at him were not afraid anymore. They were resolute. He muttered something under his breath and slumped back into his seat. But the fire that had fueled him before was no longer the same. It had been doused, not by anger, but by collective courage sparked by one woman's stand. Maya sat back down, her heart pounding but her posture strong. She knew this was not just about her. It was about everyone who had been forced into silence in the face of people like Jason. Her stand was not only for her dignity but for theirs too. The flight continued, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Where there had been tension, now there was quiet admiration. Where there had been fear, now there was relief. Some passengers leaned over as the hours passed, offering Maya soft words of gratitude. One elderly woman touched her arm gently and whispered, "Thank you, dear, for saying what we all wanted to." A father traveling with his teenage daughter gave her a nod that carried unspoken meaning, gratitude for showing his child what courage looked like. Maya accepted these gestures humbly, never once boasting or elevating herself. She simply smiled, grateful that her choice to stand had meant something. Jason, on the other hand, had grown small in his seat. His earlier bravado had drained, leaving behind only the restless shifting of a man who realized the room no longer belonged to him. He tried once or twice to mutter insults, but the attendants were quick to shut him down, and the passengers no longer pretended not to hear. Each time he spoke, the weight of the cabin pressed back against him, a reminder that his control had dissolved. As the flight carried on, Maya looked once more out the window, the clouds illuminated by the sun above them. She thought about the speech she would give at the conference, about the stories she wanted to tell. She realized then that her words on that stage would come with even greater conviction because of what she had lived in this cabin. She had stood not just for herself but for something larger, for dignity, for respect, for the truth that silence in the face of cruelty is not peace, but surrender. And surrender was never an option. The storm had come, and she had met it with strength. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone watching of something simple yet profound. Sometimes the greatest victories are not in how loud we can shout, but in how firmly we can stand. The hum of the engines was steady, but inside the cabin there was a different hum, one that could not be heard but could be felt. It was the quiet energy of dozens of passengers processing what they had just seen. The moment when Maya stood tall and refused to let Jason's behavior pass unnoticed had changed the entire mood of the flight. For so long, he had filled the space with his voice, his insults, his presence, but now that power was gone. He sat in his seat, rigid and restless, staring at the floor as if the patterned carpet could swallow him whole. His shoulders hunched, his earlier smirk replaced by a tight scowl. He wanted to believe he was still in control, but the silence around him told another story. It was not the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of rejection. Maya leaned back into her seat, her gaze on the clouds rolling past the window. She allowed herself to breathe deeply for the first time since the flight had begun. It was not triumph she felt, not the thrill of victory, but something quieter, something steadier. It was the calm that comes after a storm, when you realize that standing firm has kept you safe and has protected others too. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, and though her heart still beat with the memory of adrenaline, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had refused to bend. Around her, passengers exchanged glances and whispers. Some looked at Jason with disbelief, others with open disgust. A mother quietly explained to her young son that courage does not always mean fighting with fists. Sometimes it means speaking up with honesty. A businessman 2 rows back shook his head, muttering that he had never seen someone so unkind exposed so quickly. The attendants moved with more purpose now, their steps brisk, their voices firmer, no longer tiptoeing around Jason's moods. They had witnessed the shift too, and they were not going to let the atmosphere slip back into fear. Jason shifted uncomfortably, his legs bouncing with nervous energy. For the first time in years, he felt small in public. He had always counted on his voice to overpower, his size to intimidate, his words to sting. But now none of that mattered. The more he muttered, the less anyone listened. The more he tried to glare, the more people looked away, not out of fear, but out of dismissal. It was as though the crowd had finally seen behind the curtain, and there was no respect left to give him. He had become what he had always tried to force others to feel: powerless. The silence grew heavier as the flight stretched on. Jason tried once more to stir up attention, mumbling about how people were too sensitive and the world had changed for the worse. But this time, passengers did not shift uncomfortably or pretend not to hear. Instead, a man across the aisle leaned in and said plainly, "We heard enough from you already." His voice was calm, not aggressive, but it carried the weight of the cabin's collective agreement. Jason clenched his fists, but he said nothing in return. For him, silence had always been something to impose on others, never something to endure himself. Now he sat trapped inside it. Maya felt the quiet support of the people around her. She did not need their applause, but the way strangers met her eyes with soft nods and subtle smiles was enough. It reminded her that courage often awakens courage in others. What began as her stand alone had become a shared strength, spreading quietly through the cabin like ripples in water. The silence was not empty anymore, it was full of meaning. It was the silence of people refusing to go back to the way things were just hours before. Time moved slowly in that cabin, the minutes stretching as the engines roared outside. Jason stared out his own window now, pretending not to notice the stairs, but every so often his jaw tightened. His pride gnawed at him. He replayed the moment in his head, the way Maya had spoken, the way the passengers had turned against him. He wanted to believe he could still win back the attention, but every attempt crumbled before it began. He had been exposed, and there was no way to hide it. The attendant spoke quietly with Maya as they passed by, asking if she was all right, offering her extra water, checking in with the kind of care that comes not from obligation, but from respect. She thanked them each time with a smile, her voice calm, her composure unshaken. She knew she had become more than a passenger in that moment. She had become a mirror for the entire cabin, showing them that strength could exist in quiet forms, that dignity could disarm cruelty more powerfully than shouting ever could. The hush of the cabin deepened when the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. He announced that law enforcement would be meeting the plane upon landing to address a passenger's misconduct. He did not name Jason, but everyone knew. The words were confirmation of what they had all been waiting for, that his behavior would not vanish into silence, that accountability would follow him even after the wheels touched the ground. Jason froze at the announcement, his face pale, his body stiff. For the first time, his confidence cracked wide enough for everyone to see the fear beneath it. The rest of the flight unfolded in quiet solidarity. Passengers read, whispered, or closed their eyes, but their awareness remained sharp. The earlier chaos had settled into a strange unity, strangers bound together by what they had witnessed. The silence was no longer heavy with fear, but filled with something stronger: respect. Respect for the woman who had refused to bow her head, and respect for the truth that had finally filled the cabin louder than Jason's voice ever could. Maya looked once more out her window as the sky began to darken, the horizon glowing faintly with the last light of day. She thought about what had happened, about how quickly ordinary moments could transform into defining ones. She had not asked for this confrontation, but she had not turned away from it either. And though Jason still sat only a few feet away, bitter and restless, she no longer saw him as a threat. He had already been defeated not by force, but by silence, by the silence of those who would no longer allow his words to dominate, and by her own refusal to surrender her dignity. As the plane descended, the hush remained. No one spoke loudly, no one laughed. They waited. They watched. The silence was not empty now. It was the sound of justice approaching, the sound of truth settling in, the sound of a man realizing that he was no longer untouchable. And for Maya, it was the sound of peace earned through the quiet courage of standing tall. The plane began its slow descent, the engines shifting in pitch as the ground below grew closer. Passengers straightened in their seats, tucking away books and powering down screens, but their attention was not on the landing. Their attention was still fixed on Jason, who sat hunched and silent, his earlier arrogance crumbling piece by piece. His eyes darted to the window, then to the aisle, then down to his hands that twisted nervously in his lap. For the first time he seemed unsure of himself. For the first time his voice was gone. Maya sat 2 rows away, her back straight, her gaze calm. She had endured the storm and emerged with her dignity unshaken. The cabin had watched her hold her ground with a quiet strength that no insult could pierce. Now, as the captain reminded everyone to fasten their seatbelts, she allowed herself a deep breath, knowing the moment of reckoning was near. She had not wished for punishment, but she knew accountability mattered. Without it, men like Jason would keep believing they could say and do anything without consequence. As the wheels touched the runway with a heavy thud, the silence in the cabin deepened. Everyone knew what was coming. The attendants moved briskly, collecting stray cups and reminding passengers to remain seated until the seatbelt sign was off. Yet there was a quiet energy between them, the kind of alertness that comes from knowing the final act of a story is about to unfold. Jason shifted in his seat, his leg bouncing rapidly, his hands clenching and unclenching. He muttered under his breath, but no one listened. His power had vanished hours ago, and all that remained was the echo of his anger, hollow and weak. When the plane rolled to a stop and the chime sounded, passengers usually sprang up, reaching for bags, eager to leave. But this time no one moved. The aisles remained clear, the passengers still buckled. They were not afraid of Jason anymore, but they knew the attendants had asked for cooperation. Everyone waited in a unity rarely seen among strangers. The only one who looked restless was Jason. He tugged at his seatbelt, trying to rise before the sign dimmed, only to be told sharply to sit down. The authority in the attendant's voice silenced him again, and he slumped back, his bravado broken. The door opened, and the sound of heavy steps echoed down the jet bridge. Uniformed officers boarded swiftly, their expressions calm but serious. The air inside the cabin shifted once more, this time filled with quiet anticipation. Every pair of eyes followed them as they moved down the aisle. Jason straightened in his seat, trying to put on the mask of confidence he had worn so easily before, but it no longer fit. His face was pale, his words stumbled. "It was just a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "She's exaggerating, it wasn't like that." But the cabin, filled with witnesses, did not agree. Passengers spoke up immediately. A woman from the front explained what she had seen. A man across the aisle confirmed it. Even the mother with the 2 children raised her voice, describing Jason's behavior clearly, her trembling tone filled with the relief of finally being heard. Each account wove together a story too strong to deny. Jason's excuses withered with each word spoken against him. The officers did not need convincing. The truth was written on every face in the cabin, every whisper of support directed at Maya. One officer gestured for Jason to stand. His resistance came only in words now, frantic mutters about unfairness, about being targeted, about no one understanding him. But when he looked around for allies, he found none. The passengers who had once shrunk under his loud voice now sat upright, their gazes steady. They had seen him for who he truly was, and they were not going to let him twist the story. Jason rose reluctantly, his hands trembling as the officers guided him toward the exit. His shoulders, once so broad and squared, now drooped under the weight of his own downfall. As he passed through the aisle, silence filled the cabin again, but it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of justice. People watched him go, some shaking their heads, others looking away entirely, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of their attention. When the officers finally let him off the plane, the tension that had lingered in the cabin seemed to lift like a fog burned away by the sun. The attendants thanked the passengers for their patience, their voices steadier now, free of the strain that had marked them earlier. Slowly, people began to rise, reaching for their bags, speaking softly to one another about what they had witnessed. Some paused to glance at Maya, offering small words of gratitude as they passed. "You were so strong," whispered the elderly woman who had touched her arm earlier. "Thank you." A young man nodded firmly as he collected his bag. "You inspired us," he said. Each word, each gesture was quiet but full of weight. Maya accepted their thanks with humility. She had not stood for praise, and she did not see herself as a hero. She had only done what her heart demanded, refused to let cruelty go unanswered. But as she walked off the plane, she realized the moment had grown beyond her. It had touched everyone on that flight. It had reminded them all that even in the smallest places, a cramped cabin thousands of feet in the air, dignity and courage could still stand tall. In the terminal, she paused for a moment, letting the crowd flow past her. She thought about the conference ahead, about the words she had prepared. But she also thought about the unplanned words she had spoken, words that had carried more weight than any speech. She knew now that her message would be different, deeper. She would speak not just about equality and respect as ideas, but as lived truths, as choices made in moments of pressure. Because she had lived it, she had felt the silence turn into solidarity. She had seen arrogance crumble before dignity. Jason was gone now, escorted by officers into a future where his actions would follow him. Maya did not think of him with hate. She thought of him as a warning, a reminder of what happens when people believe cruelty is strength. And she thought of the cabin full of strangers who had chosen, in the end, to see the truth and stand quietly behind it. As she walked forward, her steps steady, her heart strong, she realized that consequences were not just punishments handed down by others. Consequences were also lessons rippling outward. Jason would face his, but so would everyone on that flight. They would carry the memory of that day, the image of a woman who stood without anger, without fear, and reminded them all of what strength truly looked like. And for Maya, that was enough. The memory of that flight lingered long after the wheels touched the ground, and the passengers stepped back into the familiar chaos of the airport terminal. People dispersed in every direction, some rushing to connecting flights, others greeting waiting families, but what had happened in the sky followed them all. It was not the kind of story that dissolved with time. It was the kind that stayed pressed into the heart, reshaping how people thought about strength, dignity, and courage. And at the center of that memory was Maya. She walked through the terminal with her bag slung over her shoulder, her posture upright, her face calm. On the surface, she looked like any other traveler, blending into the current of people, but those who had shared the cabin with her knew she was different. They had seen her stand in the face of cruelty without losing herself, and that image would not leave them. Some passengers approached quietly before parting ways, offering final words of gratitude. A young woman whispered, "You gave me courage," before hurrying away. An older man pressed his hand to his chest and simply nodded as he passed. These moments were brief, but they were enough to remind Maya that her choice had mattered. In the days that followed, the story spread beyond the flight. Passengers shared it with friends and family, some posting about it on social media, describing how a woman had stood with grace against a man who had tried to dominate with noise and anger. The details shifted depending on who told it. Some focused on her calm words, others on the silence of the cabin that had turned into quiet solidarity. But the heart of the story remained unchanged. It was a story of dignity defeating arrogance, of quiet courage silencing cruelty. Maya never sought the attention. She went to the conference as planned, standing on the stage with her notes in hand, but when she spoke, her words carried more weight than even she expected. She had prepared carefully, but what came out was more than rehearsed lines. It was lived truth. She spoke of the flight without naming names, describing how silence can either protect injustice or break it, how standing tall in difficult moments is not just about one person, but about everyone who watches. Her audience leaned forward, drawn in by the authenticity of her voice. They were not listening to theory. They were listening to someone who had stood in the fire and come out stronger. The response was overwhelming. People lined up afterward to thank her, to share their own stories of times when they had stayed silent and wished they had spoken, or times when they had spoken and found courage they did not know they had. Maya listened to each of them, her heart heavy yet hopeful. She knew now that the fight for dignity was not in grand battles but in countless small moments, in every office, every classroom, every flight. Jason, meanwhile, faced consequences that extended beyond the embarrassment of being escorted off the plane. The airline issued a report and law enforcement pursued charges of disorderly conduct. His name, once just another traveler on a passenger list, now carried the weight of his actions. Where once he had relied on being the loudest voice in the room, he now found his voice drowned out by the truth of what had been witnessed. And while he might have raged privately about unfairness, deep down he had been forced to confront something he could not escape. His behavior had finally met a boundary it could not cross. For the passengers who had been there, the legacy of the moment was personal. Some told the story to their children, using Maya as an example of what it means to stand with dignity. Others carried it quietly inside, a reminder to themselves that the next time they faced injustice, they would not remain silent. The mother who had struggled to quiet her 2 children on the flight later told friends that Maya had shown her what she wanted her kids to learn, that strength does not come from loudness but from truth. Maya herself carried the legacy in a quieter way. She did not dwell on Jason's face or the ugliness of his words. Instead, she carried the memory of the passengers who had finally spoken up, the way silence had turned into solidarity. She carried the image of the elderly woman's trembling hand on her arm, of the father's nod of gratitude, of the way people had looked at her not as a victim but as a pillar. These were the memories that mattered, the ones that reminded her why her voice and her presence could never be small. Months later, when she boarded another plane, she thought of that flight. The hum of the engines was the same, the shuffle of passengers identical. Yet she knew she would never see the cabin of an airplane the same way again. It had become more than a place of travel. It had become a stage where truth had stood against cruelty. She fastened her seatbelt, looked out the window, and allowed herself a small smile. She knew she would keep standing wherever she went, because the world always needed reminders that dignity is not fragile, it is fierce. The story of that flight lived on, not because of Jason's anger, but because of Maya's strength. In the end, that was the legacy that mattered, not the noise of one man trying to control others, but the quiet courage of one woman who showed an entire cabin what it means to stand tall. It became a story told in living rooms, shared at dinner tables, written about in blogs and community pages. And every time it was told, it grew, carrying the lesson further, that cruelty may shout but courage speaks louder. And so, the legacy of that moment stretched far beyond the walls of a single airplane. It became a reminder that no matter where we are, 30,000 feet in the air or standing on the ground, we all carry the power to make a choice. To be silent and let injustice thrive, or to stand even when our voice shakes. Maya had chosen to stand, and in doing so, she gave others permission to believe they could too. That was the true legacy, one that no insult could erase, one that would ripple outward long after the flight had ended.